So it's not just what colour, 64 colours of light you want to choose, but 4 zones of colour. And then when we put the music on, it'll pulsate. That lighting will pulsate to the beat of the music. And then we can add this 4D experience, as they call it, where the seat will then, pulsate to the music as well. So you've got this kind of Mercedes, which is like, and I'm like, does your average E-Class buyer really want this?
Give a shit? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So fascinating to see how that all plays out.
Hello, I'm Drew Smith.
And I'm Joe Simpson.
And welcome to Looking Out, the podcast, auditory sidekick to the newsletter, in which we connect the dots between the automotive industry, mobility, design, and culture. And yes, that's right. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is the first time that we are coming to you in glorious 1080p. For those of you who are listening in on your favorite podcast app, you can now head to YouTube and search for Looking Out Podcast and see what us two munters look like in real life. That's fair, isn't it, Joe?
I think it is.
So, coming up in this show, we are going to be talking about the new Tesla Model 3, which is a bundle of surprises. And we're also going to be talking about a really interesting little French company called Lormauto and what it tells us about the future of circularity in the automotive industry. So, Joe, do you want to kick us off with the new Tesla Model 3?
Yes, Drew. Thanks. So, in the last episode of Looking Out, the podcast, we talked about the Munich Auto Show, the IAA, or the ERR, to be correct. And one of the standout launches there was of the new so-called Highland Tesla Model 3. Now, interesting for a few reasons, and, I'm sure there are listeners and viewers saying this isn't interesting at all, it looks no different. But it was interesting, for one, that Tesla chose to be at a major international auto show, a place where it doesn't usually show up. And I think the new Model 3 is very interesting in the context of how the industry and how car design is evolving. Drew, before I continue with my thoughts, do you have anything that you want to kind of chip in at this point?
Oh, look, I think probably the thing that stuck out most for me with the new Model 3 was the fact that Tesla has managed to make the interior look even more spare than it was before. And, there's a real trick to doing simplicity well. And, if we think of, it's a cliched example, but Apple, right? And Apple products. And when you strip and strip and strip away extraneous detail, there's very little room left to hide when it comes to your manufacturing processes and material qualities and what have you. Whenever you rode in, or whenever I rode in a previous Model 3, it was so evident that they didn't quite have the perceived quality to match the simplicity that they were going for in the interior. Now, with this new car, they've simplified it even further. And, from a cost of manufacture point of view, that's going to be a good thing for Tesla, right? Because they'll be able to extract more margin. What I'm super, super, super curious to see is how that translates into a living three-dimensional product. Now, I happen to know somebody who works in the craftsmanship team at Tesla, and they are really, really proud of what they've managed to achieve with this car. But I also know that it's been a battle for a brand like Tesla to get the right balance between ornamentation and bright work and tinsel and the cost of production that they're aiming for. So that's probably the biggest sort of question that's running through my mind with Highland.
So maybe I can fill in a little bit in terms of your kind of curiosity, having seen, touched, and sat in it. I, or one of my colleagues actually, and I think it was a really neat phrase, described this as car designer's maths puzzle. And
Wow.
I find this interesting because I think it's sort of an illustration of how Elon thinks, or I think it's an illustration of how Elon thinks, in that,
Right.
to me, what the new Model 3 represents is a car that I think is cheaper to produce than before. A car that, through a facelift, improves its efficiency quite a lot, which gives Tesla the option of either going slightly further on the same battery pack as before, or meaning that they can probably take a few batteries out. Battery packs don't really work like that, but in theory, they can take a few batteries out to achieve the same range, which saves them cost. And then, in terms of what you articulated about probably the traditional way in which particularly an automotive interior is set up and how it feels, they have managed to redesign things and take stuff out in terms of a manufacturing process. So the IP is now basically, the IP being the dashboard to people not in the industry, is now kind of like an overwrapped top section. So you've just got one single crash pad into which is kind of cut a section into which they drop what becomes the decorative element and the air outlet.
Right.
And it's kind of representative of a way of thinking which simplifies, it reduces the number of parts. But actually, and I think to your friend, I think I know who we're talking about, this point, it actually gives you a perception of quality which increases the kind of compared to before. There's no longer the sort of obviously fake veneer of wood that came in that step on the previous model. And instead we have this quite nice sort of fabric element and quite an interestingly kind of profiled section that drops into the top of the IP. But what's also interesting is there's other things have gone. So they remove the indicator stalks, for instance, and place those onto the steering wheel control. This is another cost save, reducing kind of parts. But then what they do is they kind of give back to the user. So what I think this cost saving has allowed is then a move to, they put this, I think it's a 9-inch rear screen in the back. Now, in other brands, that if there's a screen there, it's usually just to control the climate. You can't do anything else. In the Model 3, guess what? You can play YouTube. You can play the games.
Sure. It was only 2 weeks ago we were talking about a BMW, a €98,000 BMW 5 Series that doesn't even have like air conditioning controls.
That you have to pay extra.
Right.
You have to pay extra for the air conditioning controls, and that's all you can do, on a car that's twice the price as a Model 3.
Yeah.
And I think this is what's interesting. I guess my point is that I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is that I think we're reaching this point where the automotive world is diverging between those who stick to the kind of old, if you like, tropes of what conveys premium, and those like Tesla who are moving to a new world where I think, yes, the fit and finish and perception of quality is actually slightly better than before, but it is simplified. It's even more spare. But actually what you're getting in your premium comes through the kind of digital content and the overall experience that you might have in the car. The other thing that's really interesting about it then is that by doing this and I think saving money on how much the car costs to build, it gives Tesla more room to play with. We all know, or most of us in the industry know, Tesla has been kind of fighting a war their margins are so good that they've been able to eat into their own margin and reduce the price of Model 3 and Model Y at various points in the past few months. And that's been fascinating to watch because other OEMs who don't have the same margins, and particularly in China where most of those brands are kind of losing money, kind of some of them felt the need to follow suit to kind of continue competing and kind of to keep their volumes up. But I think it's part of a larger strategic play, which means that Highland can either reduce the kind of asking price, the entry-level asking price of the car, or in future he can choose to kind of erode his own margins to gain volume by just dropping the price through discounting. And that puts massive pressure on everybody else. And particularly in China, where I see these brands doing fantastic and interesting stuff. And really, we should talk about that in another show, about the kind of approach to technology, the approach to kind of solving use case problems through car design, which some of the kind of Chinese brands like Li Auto are taking a fascinating approach to. But they're all losing money. And at some point, you know, despite the setup of China, something gives, and people are expecting a bloodbath over the next few years.
And I think if we then bring it back to thinking how the Europeans fit into all of this, of course, there was that fantastic evocation you gave us of the rear seat of the 5 Series, where the window switches would look out of place, i.e. too crappy for a Dacia Duster. But I was in a Mercedes EQS SUV last week.
Yeah.
And I was having a really good poke around that car. And what is fascinating is that there is so much evidence of Mercedes desperately trying to play the old game when it comes to color, material, and finish, and just not having the money to execute. And, you know, in Australia, this is a $300,000 car. I mean, it's super, super, super expensive. And a Hyundai or Kia would put this thing to shame when it comes to sort of the perceived quality of the interior. And I think there's a really interesting question that Highland Tesla Model 3, the facelifted Tesla Model 3, poses to the market, which is what do customers actually really value in an interior now? And what is it that sets their hearts aflutter? And I think this is why this sort of designer's mathematics framing is really, really interesting, because cars for many people are a highly emotive purchase, right? And the way in which cars have tapped into our emotions have been not just through sight, but through touch and through sound and through smell. And when you minimize sort of the sensory richness to the extent that something like Highland does, you need to have new hallmarks, new calling cards for what quality is.
Yeah.
And okay, so there's a hypothesis, I guess, that Highland poses, which is that is digital content, and it is digital interaction, right? And it is, if you like, digital novelty. And I'm really, really curious to see how that plays out.
Indeed, I think it's what's fascinating about the times we find ourselves in the industry, and it's why I talk about this kind of this split. And I can see maybe old world or new world is the wrong phrasing, but to the kind of premium European brands, this has been their kind of hallmark for so long. And as you say, and as the EQS example, the 5 Series example show, well, if electrification for those brands takes away their ability to execute at the previous level, then what do they have? Because right now, brands like Tesla, brands like the Chinese are definitely ahead in terms of the software-enabled car or the kind of software sort of experience-led car. Right. And I think it opens up opportunities for other and new brands to kind of define what that future premium is. And it also asks questions around buyers. What do younger buyers, people our age and below, sort of in their 30s, 40s, what do they expect and want? What does someone in their 60s, 70s want? And just to round this off, I think it's fascinating to then draw a parallel with the new Mercedes E-Class, which we didn't talk about a lot on the last episode, but how Mercedes in that car seem to be doing a better job, at least on the face of it, than BMW, of kind of giving that sense of quality and old world. But we're then trying to mix it, I mean, in my view, relatively unsuccessfully, with software and digital tinsel.
The electrically controlled vents.
The electrically yes,
they're right there. I can reach them. I can reach them.
But this band of light which goes round under the cowl, and they were like, oh yeah, and you can adjust how much you want the intensity in 4 zones. So it's not just what color, 64 colors of light you want to choose, but 4 zones of color. And then when we put the music on, it'll pulsate. That lighting will pulsate to the beat of the music. And then we can add this 4D experience, as they call it, where the seat will then, pulsate to the music as well. So you've got this kind of Mercedes, which is like, and I'm like, does your average E-Class buyer really want this?
Give a shit. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So fascinating to see how that all plays out.
The one kind of final example that I think is fascinating to call in here is probably the new Mini, right?
Yeah.
Because of all the European brands at the moment, it feels like the one that is most successfully treading this line between new form, new technology, executing a central display with a brand new piece of technology. It's a circular OLED, and consolidating a whole bunch of functionality within this screen, which, as we know, is a huge cost-saving measure, but it doesn't feel like a cost-saving measure because of the way the dash architecture has been put together.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's still some physical controls and little sort of nods to the past, like the stop-start button is not a flick. You turn it like a key, even though it's kind of fixed into the IP. Right. And the use of fabric and materials that are not sort of traditional luxury, so not leather. I mean, there was leather option on the seats, but a lot of, rather than going to fake leather, actually going to fabrics. And I think, just to kind of round on that point, to me, what was fascinating about that, and I did read about this somewhere, I think it was someone I'm connected to on LinkedIn who works at Mini, was articulating, and the minute they said it, I was like, yes, you can see that in the car. A UX team and an interior team who worked on that stuff hand in hand.
Yes.
And you can see it just in that interior. It's like, it's actually not two teams that have worked in separate buildings and never met.
Right.
It's 100%. They thought about this all together and it works.
100%. Oh, that makes my heart sing. Oh, gorgeous. All right, let's move on to the next topic for today. Now, to provide perhaps a little bit of context to my interest in this, a little while back, I was involved in a forum that brought together Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's really hard to say at 10 o'clock in the evening. And a bunch of very senior people at the organization that I worked for. And the remit of this forum was to bring together the intellectual might of MIT and this management consulting company to think about some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, it just so happened that I was working in a collaborative team that was looking at the future of mobility in particular. And, in the classic sort of management consulting workshop way, no ideas were meant to be off the table. There was no such thing as a bad idea. And ever since our friend Joe, Mark Charmer, talked to us many, many, many years ago about the idea of electrifying Saab 900s,
Right.
I have had in the back of my head this idea that it would be super, super interesting to understand to what extent it was really feasible to retrofit the existing internal combustion engine fleet with EV powertrains. Now, I put this idea on the table, and the global head of my business, who was responsible for our automotive relationships, did this. It was like the equivalent of Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada when she didn't like something.
And of course, there's the pursing of the lips.
Which means?
Catastrophe. Just go.
And this guy gave me his pursed lips. And I knew that from that moment on, that topic was never to be discussed again. Because, let's face it, at the end of the day, the business that I worked for couldn't make any money out of it. And that was really the MO of the whole exercise. So that's kind of the context for this. And, you know, thanks to Mark and what have you, I've always been curious about this idea. And I will admit that there is a degree to which it feels very much like a fringe idea. It feels like an idea which is the preserve of bearded men, probably with body odor issues, stuck in sheds, tinkering with a rusty MG, right? And trying to put a 300 horsepower
We've all got an
Tesla
image.
motor. Yeah, trying to put a 300 horsepower Tesla motor into a rusty MG. That being said, there is this company in France called Lormauto, and I'm absolutely fascinated by them. There were 2.6 million of the original Renault Twingo produced.
Really? 2.6 million, wow.
Absolutely iconic car, right?
Yeah.
For people that know them, it's very difficult not to love them. And just a beautiful piece of design, headed up by Patrick Lequemel when he was at Renault, fairly early days for Patrick, I think.
Yeah.
And what this company is doing is buying up old Renault Twingos and refitting them with an electric powertrain. 70% of the base vehicle remains. The other 30% is tied up, obviously, with drivetrain and battery. But they've also partnered with Forvia, which is the new merged form of Faurecia and Hella, to completely redo the interiors. And here's the really interesting bit. They offer these cars for €100 a month. You can't buy them.
What?
€100 a month. Maybe 200. There are different figures going around.
But that
they're
sounds,
€100.
even for an old car, really cheap.
Right. And what you get is essentially a remanufactured Twingo with 100 kilometers of range. They claim that it results in 47% lower emissions, lifetime emissions, compared to the purchase of a new EV. And 66% lower lifetime emissions than the purchase of a equivalent sized diesel engine vehicle, right? And they are currently taking deposits, and the cars are going to be on the road later this year, early next year.
Right.
So that's super interesting. What I also find interesting is that as I was sort of digging into this, it turns out that Renault themselves, yes, they're doing kind of the classic sort of EV refits on Renault 5s and Renault 4s, but they are developing a retrofit kit for their master vans. And they have an entire facility set up for this called the Refactory, which is part of their circular cluster in Flins, in France.
Yeah.
So this isn't really that much of a fringe interest. There is something to it, and I'm really curious to hear your take on this, because of course we talked about the iVision Circular, BMW's concept from Munich 2 years ago. Okay, cool, but it's another new product. What about the stuff that we've already got?
I think it's fascinating. I think there are a few things. One is that, if people don't know, it's worth reading on what Renault are doing. They're being largely open about it, and I think in a lot of the industry they are actually considered the leaders in this space. So if you're interested in kind of circularity and remanufacturing stuff, go and have a read about that. I think that the thing I find very interesting is the question that it poses, as you've just kind of articulated, around the car industry has been built for 100 years, slightly more, on the idea that we bang a load of raw materials through a factory and out of the other end plops a car. And then as the OEM, that is sold usually to a national sales organization who then sell it to a customer. And then off they go. And they have interaction with the manufacturer, except it's not the manufacturer, through dealers that are franchises of the brand when they need to service the car. And then usually somewhere between about 3 and 6 years, everybody loses contact, and fundamentally OEMs have no idea where their cars end up. But at the same time, you've got this legislation coming from the other end. There's already end-of-life vehicle legislation that says certain things about recyclability and kind of stuff like that, and manufacturers have to kind of take care of that. So this is kind of an acceleration of, or this is potentially an acceleration of where we might get to in the future, where I think manufacturers have to think, what happens to the vehicle at the end of its life? How can we extend its life? Rather than just thinking about the output of the factory and the value we get from that. How can we continue to fundamentally, and this sounds very cynical, but derive value from the fact that we put all these materials into service, and actually in the future just scrapping them, shredding them, burying them in the ground is not going to be allowed. And then I think on top of that is this idea that there are cars. You mentioned the Saab 900 that Mark talked about. The Twingo is an obvious one. We can probably all think of others where there are vehicles that are loved, generally the kind of characterful, significant vehicles, which are all aging 20, 30, 40 years old. But actually, if they've been kind of maintained, and a car like the Saab, you know, they generally kind of long lasting. They were built in Sweden to kind of survive the harsh climate here. That you can sort of maybe take something that has a lot of still, you know, integrity and value and put a new powertrain in it and give it a new lease of life. And I think it's really interesting to hear that Renault are actually thinking about that as a kind of OEM, you know, original equipment manufacturer, rather than it being this bearded men in sheds kind of side interest.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 points that are really interesting there for me. The first one is, you know, if we look at what cars have been electrified, what sort of older cars have been electrified, they are by and large iconic vehicles. Now, the purists might, you know, scream into their tea at seeing something like a 911 be electrified, or seeing a BMW 2002 be electrified, or, you know, an original Fiat Cinquecento or a Beetle or a Volkswagen Camry or whatever. Who gives a fuck? It keeps it on the road, right? Yeah.
Well,
because as part of that whole remanufacturing process, these vehicles are getting essentially restored from the ground up. And I know, look, we're talking about sort of a 1% pursuit at this point in terms of this being something that is being done by people with a lot of money to spare. But that brings me on to my second point, which is around Lormauto's decision to rent these things for $100 or $200 euros a month. They're not selling them. So they are retaining the asset, and
Yes.
they have an incentive, therefore, to sweat that asset for a lot longer. But they also have an incentive to work out how to produce a safe, reliable, functional, and yes, enjoyable vehicle, EV, at the lowest cost possible. And when you start thinking about developing drivetrain replacements for something like a Renault Twingo, as I said, 2.6 million produced, then you start thinking, shit, there's got to be some economies of scale to this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what's fascinating about that business model is that it sounds a bit like a win-win, in that there's a lot of comment out there at the moment, and actually truth, in the fact that new electric vehicles are way too expensive for most people. I mean, if you can afford a car in the world, you're already in a kind of top percentile. If you can afford an electric car, you're in the top sort of point something percentile. They are too expensive. And to make them go mainstream, we have to bring the cost down. Now, there's numerous ways you can do that: make smaller batteries, reduce the cost of batteries in new cars, but this is another way. So if the aim is to decarbonize travel, then yes, you have the kind of what goes into the battery, but then there's the kind of emissions that you're taking away from that, and the emissions you're taking away from producing what would otherwise be a new vehicle to kind of replace that Twingo. So I think that's fascinating, because you get more people then have sort of accessibility to electric mobility and kind of decarbonized travel. But then, as you say, it creates this scenario where the in this case Lormauto keep the kind of the asset on their books, and that switches the kind of what you're incentivized to do, what you actually need the vehicle and the powertrain to keep doing, how you think about what you do sort of 5-10 years down the line.
Exactly.
And it's not a secret to say that at the moment, yes, there are some regulations, especially in Europe, but mostly for OEMs, the incentivization is all around that point where it goes out the factory and it's brand new. And there's not so much around what happens down the line.
And all of the costs, pretty much from that point onwards, the OEM externalizes. It's just
right.
It's not my problem. Whereas Lormauto, reading their vision, they're like, we want to create cars for life. We want to create cars that, and this is the reality of the cars that have been manufactured for quite some time now, is that, drivetrain aside, they're pretty bloody robust things, right? And there's no reason why they shouldn't have extremely long service lives.
Yeah. And particularly when you start to understand the sheer amount of raw materials that are put into a car, and let's be honest, planetary boundaries that we are starting to butt up against, you start to think, oh shit, we do need to, how do we make this thing actually live 50 years? But one thing that's not so much related to that I'm fascinated by about this, is that this kind of cheap, let's call it subscription model, and Lormauto keeping the ownership or the asset on their books, is fascinating in another way, I think, because it starts to migrate us towards a logic which is something that Horace Didier talked about when you interviewed him. And that's that rather than thinking about the value being in the thing, an object, and the ownership of it, you are starting to migrate towards the value that you kind of can derive from vehicle miles traveled. It's not that, because it's still a flat amount per month, and someone can maybe choose, I guess, I don't know how this subscription works, whether there's a kind of kilometer limit on it, or whether you drive 50 kilometers or 5,000 in the month, they still charge you the same. You just have to pay for your charging. But it does start to eke us towards that. And I think that's fascinating in the context of, we hear a lot of people, particularly in the media, and again, those kind of people you referenced before, the bearded men in sheds, no offense to them, that people want to own things, and I don't like this subscription thing and being on the hook forever and, you know, it coming from the OEM. But actually, yes, there are issues with that model, but there are also benefits from it in terms of wider environmental and potentially moving towards thinking about not the value of stuff per se, but the value of, you know, how far you travel in a kind of given period.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is sort of personal for me in a way, because I stopped thinking of myself as being somebody sort of purely interested in cars as a cultural object, but actually starting to think about, okay, moving people and stuff from A to B. And this is the perfect example of a new product and service paradigm that starts to fit into that space. Yes, there is a car which is a part of it, but it is just a part of a more broadly considered whole. As with all of these things, the proof is going to be in the pudding with Lormauto, and by pudding I mean actually launching. You know, I think even if we look at established OEMs, we've seen so many false dawns for shared ownership models, and that's a question that many OEMs still haven't managed to answer successfully.
No.
So it'll be really interesting to see if Lormauto, with a very, very different set of incentives and the total absence of legacy when it comes to digging shit out of the ground and chucking it down a production line, whether they can actually build a sustainable business out of this. But I tell you what, given my experience in that workshop with MIT, I will be rooting for them. I am absolutely gunning for this company to succeed.
Here.
But look, that's it for this 8th episode of Looking Out the podcast, now coming live to you on YouTube. But guess what? There's going to be another one. There's going to be episode 9. And we already know that we are going to be looking closer at the new Toyota Century SUV, because quite frankly, it's a bit of an odd duck. And I'm somewhat surprised that it even exists. But that's what we're going to dive into in the next show. And I think it's
fair to say, Drew, that this will be where YouTube comes into its own, because we have some interesting visualizations and annotations which people might want to see and look at rather than just listen to.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to be going back to our days in design school and doing a line-by-line analysis of this very strange, very luxurious SUV. All that being said, if you liked this show, please leave us a review. Click like, subscribe, I think is what people say on YouTube. The
Let's
young
not
kids.
say that. Yeah.
Okay,
but please do subscribe.
But if you like the show, please go ahead and share it with somebody else who might like it too. We'd love you to share the love. For more about the topics in this show, you'll be able to find a bunch of links on YouTube below. Or if you're listening to the podcast, head to lookingout.io, where you will find the show notes. And it's also there that you can sign up for Looking Out, the newsletter. We haven't forgotten about the newsletter. Looking Out, the podcast, was written and presented by Drew Smith
and Joe Simpson.
With sound and production by... Well, actually, sound and production, it's going to be me, isn't it, Joe?
Well, and maybe a bit of me. But I'll probably break it.
Shit, all right. This is Drew Smith. Thank you so much for watching and listening.
Oh, dear.